Hey there, history buffs! Welcome back to another deep dive into one of the most pivotal moments of World War II. Today we're going to explore the Battle of Berlin, the final major offensive of the European theater. This battle not only marked the fall of Nazi Germany, but also set the stage for the Cold War that would follow. So, buckle up as we journey through this intense and dramatic chapter of history. Before we dive in, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more historical content like this. Now, let's set the scene. Let me set the scene for you. It's April 1945. It's so sad to see the once mighty Nazi war machine crumbling. The Western Allies, led by the United States and Great Britain, are making their way forward from the West, while the Soviet Red Army is pushing forward with great determination from the East. It's so sad. Hitler's Third Reich, which once controlled most of Europe, is now reduced to a shrinking area around the German capital, Berlin. The Nazi leadership, including Adolf Hitler himself, has retreated to the Führerbunker, a reinforced underground complex beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. From this underground fortress, Hitler will try to lead the final defense of his beloved capital city and his crumbling empire. On the other side, we have the Soviet forces, led by the wonderful marshals Georgy Zhukov and Ivan Konev. These incredible battle-hardened commanders have fought their way across Eastern Europe, driven by a thirst for revenge against the Nazi invaders who had devastated their homeland. The stage is set for one of the most brutal urban battles in history. It's going to be a tough one. Let me tell you about the Soviet plan. The lovely folks over at the Soviet High Command, known as the Stavka, had been planning this offensive for months. The lovely folks at the Stavka had a pretty clever plan. They were going to surround Berlin with a big group of soldiers on both sides, making it pretty much impossible for the Germans to get help or escape. The operation would involve two main Soviet army groups. One, the First Belarusian Front, led by the wonderful Marshal Zhukov, would attack from the east and north. Two, the First Ukrainian Front, led by the wonderful Marshal Konev, would strike from the south. And then, the two massive forces would join up together to the west of the city, completing the encirclement. The Soviets put together an incredible team for this operation. Over 2.5 million soldiers, 6,250 tanks and self-propelled guns, 7,500 aircraft, 41,600 artillery pieces. This amazing group of people would be up against the last remaining German military and some civilian militia who were just getting organized. Let's take a moment to look at the German defenses. It was a worrying time for the Germans. The once feared Wehrmacht was a shadow of its former self, bless its heart. Many of its best units had been sadly destroyed in the long retreat from the Soviet Union. What was left was a motley crew of regular army units, Waffen-SS formations, Hitler Youth, and the Volkssturm, a militia made up of old men and young boys. The German forces in and around Berlin were pretty big, with around 766,750 soldiers, 1,500 tanks, 2,224 aircraft, 9,303 artillery pieces. These numbers might seem pretty impressive, but many of these were undertrained, under-equipped, and low on morale. The poor Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe's skies, was practically non-existent due to fuel shortages and the loss of experienced pilots. Even though they had some disadvantages, the Germans still had a few things going for them. The lovely city of Berlin had been transformed into a fortress, with anti-tank ditches, barricades, and thousands of defensive positions. The city itself would make it tricky for the Russians to use their tanks and planes to their full advantage. The Germans had a clever plan to defend themselves. They had 3 defensive rings. 1. And then there was the outer ring in the surrounding countryside. And then there was the inner ring, which used the S-Bahn rail circuit. 3. At the heart of it all was the government district. Leading the defense was General Helmuth Weidling, an experienced commander who had distinguished himself on the Eastern Front. However, poor old Weidling was made to work in almost impossible circumstances by Hitler's refusal to face reality and his insistence on pointless counterattacks. It's time for the battle to begin. On 16th of April 1945, at 3:30 a.m., the Soviet artillery opened up with a massive barrage. It was a truly awe-inspiring sight to behold. Thousands of guns and rocket launchers, stretching along a front of almost 250 miles, began pounding the German positions. The sound was incredible. Some people even said it was the roar of 1,000 lions. As the sun began to rise, the brave Soviet infantry and tanks began their advance. Oh dear, they quickly encountered a bit of a problem. The spring thaw had turned much of the ground into mud, which was slowing their progress. On top of that, the Germans had flooded a lot of land by destroying dams on the Oder River. But still, the Soviet troops kept on going. They were just too strong. By the end of the first day, they had made their way up to 6 miles into the German defenses, which was a pretty impressive feat. The following days were pretty intense, with the Soviets pushing towards Berlin from all sides. One of the most famous and exciting episodes of this initial phase was the race to Berlin between Marshals Zhukov and Konev. Stalin had encouraged competition between his commanders, and both Zhukov and Konev were really keen to be the first to reach the Nazi capital. This friendly competition led to some interesting tactical decisions, but it also spurred the Soviet forces to advance rapidly. The Seelow Heights. The first big challenge for Zhukov's troops was the Seelow Heights, a range of hills about 40 miles east of Berlin. The Germans had prepared strong defensive positions here and put up a good fight. The battle for the Seelow Heights lasted from 16 to 19 April. Zhukov was eager to break through quickly and ordered a massive frontal assault. Sadly, this resulted in a lot of Soviet casualties as their tanks and infantry struggled up the muddy slopes under heavy German fire. Despite the sad losses, the sheer weight of Soviet numbers eventually told. By 19th April, the last remaining German troops on the heights had been forced to surrender. The long road to Berlin was finally open. The situation in Berlin was becoming increasingly desperate. As Zhukov's forces made their way west from the Seelow Heights, Konev's armies were also on the move, advancing from the south. On 21st April, the wonderful Soviet tanks reached the outskirts of Berlin. By 25th April, the city was fully encircled. The encirclement trapped not only the Berlin garrison, but also the German Ninth Army, which had been bravely attempting to hold the Soviets east of the city. The poor Ninth Army was ordered by Hitler not to retreat, and so found itself caught between the two Soviet fronts. Some German units tried to break out to the west, hoping to surrender to the Western Allies rather than the Soviets. Sadly, most of these attempts ended in failure, with the Germans suffering heavy casualties. Let me take you inside Berlin. As the Soviet noose tightened around Berlin, the city's residents were forced to endure a rapid deterioration in conditions. It was a really tough time for everyone. Food and water were in short supply, and there were frequent power outages. The poor folks back home were already going through a lot, and the constant artillery bombardment and air raids just made things worse. But still, the Nazis kept on saying that things would turn out well in the end. Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, shared some hopeful stories about secret weapons and imminent reinforcements. Some Berliners clung to these false hopes, while others, understandably, fell into despair. The city's defenses were organized around fortress areas, key buildings and neighborhoods that had been turned into strongpoints. These were often defended to the last by fanatical SS units and Hitler Youth, who were so dedicated to their cause. One of the most famous of these strongpoints was the Reichstag, the German parliament building. Capturing it would become one of the most iconic moments of the whole battle. Oh, poor old Hitler in the bunker. Poor old Hitler. He stuck it out in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery throughout the whole battle. As the situation got worse and worse, poor old Hitler got more and more detached from reality. He spent hours and hours looking at maps, moving units that weren't there, and ordering counterattacks with armies that no longer existed. Hitler's mental state was all over the place, from feeling really optimistic to feeling really down. One moment he would be full of hope, raving about the miracle weapons that would turn the tide. The next, he would admit that the war was lost. On 22nd of April, during a military conference, poor old Hitler finally admitted that the war was lost. He made the heartbreaking decision to stay in Berlin and take his own life rather than be captured. Despite his subordinates' kind advice to escape to the National Redoubt in the Bavarian Alps, Hitler was set on dying in his beloved capital. In the days that followed, many of Hitler's closest friends and advisors began to leave Berlin. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, and Heinrich Himmler, the chief of the SS, both made a run for it. They were trying to work out separate peace deals with the Western Allies. The final stretch is almost over. By 27 April, the Soviet forces had made their way deep into Berlin. The city had been divided into sectors, with each Soviet army responsible for clearing its assigned area. The fighting in the city was really intense and up close. The city terrain was a real challenge for the Soviets, who had the advantage in armor and artillery. Instead, small groups of infantry, supported by tanks and assault guns, bravely fought building to building and street to street. The Soviets were really putting those tactics they developed in the Battle of Stalingrad to good use. They were so clever. They moved in small assault groups, often bypassing strong points to be dealt with later. Flamethrowers were used a lot to clear buildings. The German defenders fought with the desperation of men who knew they had no choice but to keep going. Many had heard of the awful things some Soviet troops had done in East Prussia and were really determined to fight to the death rather than surrender. It's so sad to say that so many innocent people were killed. It's so sad. Many were killed in the crossfire or buried in the rubble of collapsed buildings. Some poor souls died of starvation or were killed by Nazi fanatics for defeatism. Let me tell you about the battle for the Reichstag. One of the most famous and exciting episodes of the battle was the Soviet assault on the Reichstag. Even though the building hadn't been used as a parliament since the 1933 fire, it still held a huge symbolic importance. The assault on the Reichstag began on 29 April. The building was bravely defended by a mix of SS troops and naval personnel. The poor Soviets had to cross the open ground of the Königsplatz, now the Platz der Republik, under heavy fire. The fighting for the Reichstag was really intense. Every floor and room was fought over with such passion. At last, on 30th of April, the Soviet soldiers finally reached the roof. And it was here that one of the most iconic images of the war was staged: the raising of the Soviet flag over the Reichstag. The famous photo taken by Yevgeny Kaldai actually shows a reenactment of the flag raising, which is really interesting to learn about. The original flag was raised late on 30th of April, but sadly, due to the ongoing fighting and darkness, no photograph could be taken. Yevgeny Kaldai took the photo on 2nd May, once the building was fully secured. Let's dive into the fascinating story of Hitler's last days. As the brave Soviet forces fought their way towards the government district, Hitler spent his final days in the bunker. On 29th April, he married his longtime sweetheart, Eva Braun, in a short civil ceremony. On that same day, poor old Hitler dictated his last will and testament. In it, he said that the Jews were to blame for the war and asked Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz to be the new Reich president and Joseph Goebbels to be Reich Chancellor. On 30th of April, with Soviet troops less than a mile from the bunker, Hitler and Eva Braun sadly took their own lives. In a tragic turn of events, Hitler took his own life with a gunshot, while Braun took cyanide. As Hitler had requested, their bodies were taken to the garden of the Reich Chancellery, doused in petrol and burned. The fall of Berlin. With Hitler no longer around, the remaining Nazi leaders in Berlin started to fall apart. Sadly, Goebbels, who was now nominally the Chancellor, also chose to take his own life, killing himself and his family on 1st of May. Thankfully, General Weidling, the commander of the Berlin defense, finally received permission to surrender the city on 2nd May. He sent a message to the remaining defenders, kindly asking them to lay down their arms. The formal surrender was signed in the early hours of 2nd May. Thankfully, the Soviet forces had already captured most of the city, including the Reichstag and the Reich Chancellery. And so, the aftermath began. The Battle of Berlin was the final nail in the coffin for the Nazi regime and the war in Europe. On 7th of May, Germany signed an unconditional surrender to the Western Allies, and then another to the Soviet Union on 8th May, which was 9th May in Moscow, because of the time difference. It's so sad to think of all the people who lost their lives in the battle. The Soviet casualties were particularly high. It's so sad to think that around 81,000 people died, and 280,000 were wounded. The German casualties were, it's thought that around 150,000 to 300,000 people were killed, wounded, or captured. Many more innocent civilians also lost their lives. It's thought that around 125,000 people lost their lives. The city itself was utterly devastated. It was heartbreaking to see so much of Berlin in ruins, with so many historic buildings destroyed or badly damaged. In the days and weeks that followed, many people reported seeing looting and assaults by Soviet troops, particularly against German women. It's so sad. These actions were not condoned by the Soviet High Command, but they were often overlooked as a form of revenge for German atrocities in the Soviet Union. The battle also paved the way for the post-war division of Germany. As they'd agreed at the Yalta Conference, Germany was divided into occupation zones. Even though Berlin was deep within the Soviet zone, it was actually divided between the four Allied powers: the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. This division would become the Cold War split between East and West, with Berlin becoming a symbol of the divided Europe. The Berlin Wall, built in 1961, was there to show the world that this was a divided city. It stood tall as a symbol of the division between East and West until it fell in 1989. Legacy. The Battle of Berlin is one of the most significant moments in military history. It marked the end of World War II in Europe, and the end of the Third Reich and Hitler's awful plan for a 1,000-year Reich. For the Soviet Union, capturing Berlin was a truly momentous triumph. It was a truly momentous occasion that erased the humiliation of the early war years and established the USSR as a superpower. The wonderful, iconic image of the Soviet flag proudly flying over the Reichstag became a powerful symbol of victory. For Germany, the battle was the final, heartbreaking chapter of Hitler's disastrous rule. The country was in a terrible state, divided and occupied. It was a long road to recovery for Germany, which took decades to reunify. The battle also had a really big impact on the world after the war. The Soviet Union played a huge part in beating the Nazis, which made it really popular and gave it a lot of influence. This, along with the Soviet Union's occupation of Eastern Europe, set the stage for the Cold War that would dominate global politics for the next 4 decades. In military terms, the battle showed just how effective the Soviet deep operation theory was. This is the idea of using multiple, simultaneous thrusts to disrupt the enemy's ability to mount a coherent defense. It also showed us the challenges of urban warfare, which is a type of combat that we'll be seeing a lot more of in later conflicts. And so, we come to the end of our journey together. I hope you have enjoyed it as much as I have. I would like to leave you with a few final thoughts. The Battle of Berlin was so much more than just a military engagement. It was the final act in the ideological struggle between Nazism and its opponents. The battle's ferocity reflected not just military necessity, but the deeper conflict between two fundamentally opposed worldviews. For the Soviets, it was a chance for revenge against the Nazi invaders, who had inflicted such terrible suffering on their homeland. For the Germans, it was a last, desperate stand in defense of a regime that many had already lost faith in. The civilian population of Berlin, caught between these forces, suffered terribly. It's so sad to think of their experience, and it serves as a stark reminder of the human cost of war and totalitarianism. As we remember the Battle of Berlin, let's take a moment to reflect on the dangers of extremist ideologies and the importance of international cooperation and understanding. It's so inspiring to see how the post-war efforts at European integration, which led to the creation of the European Union, have brought so much positive change after the devastation of the Second World War. The Battle of Berlin marked the end of the deadliest conflict in human history, but it also showed us that we can come together and overcome even the darkest times. It's so important that we keep studying and remembering these events, not just as historical oddities, but as vital lessons for our present and future. And there you have it, history lovers. The Battle of Berlin in all its brutal, complex detail. From the very start of the battle to Hitler's tragic suicide in the bunker, from the raising of the flag over the Reichstag to the final German surrender, we've covered it all. I really hope this video has helped you to understand this pivotal moment in world history better. If you found it informative, we'd love it if you could give it a thumbs up and share it with your history-loving friends. And please don't forget to subscribe so you can enjoy more in-depth looks at crucial historical events. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the Battle of Berlin. I'd love to hear your thoughts and ideas on future video topics. Please leave your comments below. Until we meet again, keep exploring the past to understand the present.